The morning Gideon Vale walked past 9 women dressed in their finest clothes and stopped in front of the one with mud on her boots and a tear in her sleeve. Every person standing in that town square held their breath. 9 women had traveled weeks to be chosen. 9 women had practiced their smiles, ironed their dresses, and rehearsed exactly the right things to say. And Gideon Vale, the most feared rancher in the entire territory, ignored every single one of them. He stopped in front of the woman who looked like she was already planning her escape. "I'll take her." 3 words. That's all he said. And nothing in Blackthorn Ridge was ever the same again. If you're watching this story, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see just how far this tale has traveled. And if it moves you, hit that like button and stay until the very end. Because what happens between these two people is something most of us spend a whole lifetime waiting to understand. The selection was Mayor Harlan Pruitt's idea, which meant it was a bad one from the start. Pruitt had been running Blackthorn Ridge for 11 years on a combination of backroom deals, selective memory, and the kind of cheerful corruption that passed for leadership in frontier towns. He wasn't a cruel man exactly. He was the kind of man who convinced himself that whatever served his interests also served the greater good. And he'd spent so long telling that story that he actually believed it. The problem was Gideon Vale. Gideon owned the largest cattle operation within 300 miles. His property stretched from the northern tree line all the way down to the dry creek beds at the territory's southern edge. Nearly 12,000 acres of grassland, ridge country, and rough terrain that would have broken most men inside of a season. He employed 14 hands year-round, more during Roundup, and every significant piece of commerce flowing through Blackthorn Ridge passed through his operation in one way or another. The feed store needed his business. The blacksmith relied on his contracts. Even the bank held its breath every time Gideon Vale walked through the door, because when a man controls that much land and that many cattle, his financial mood becomes everyone's financial reality. The trouble was that Gideon didn't care about any of that. He came to town when he needed supplies. He paid what he owed. He said as little as possible to as few people as possible, and he went back to his ranch before sundown like a man who found the company of cattle more straightforward than the company of humans. He was 39 years old and had been running that operation mostly alone since his father passed a decade back. He had no wife, no children, no close friends that anyone in town could name, and as far as anyone could tell, no particular desire to change any of those facts. Pruitt believed this was a waste. A man like Gideon Vale, properly settled with a wife and a family, properly anchored to the social fabric of the community. That man would be easier to talk to, easier to negotiate with, easier to bring into the fold of town politics, which Pruitt very much needed because the territory commissioner was making noise about incorporating Blackthorn Ridge into the county system. And when that happened, whoever controlled the largest landowner's loyalty would control the outcome. So Pruitt did what Pruitt always did. He arranged things. The Frontier Bride selection, that's what he called it, with the kind of cheerful enthusiasm that made people want to take a step backward, was framed publicly as a community service. The territory had more single women seeking stability than available men with property. Gideon Vale was a single man with a great deal of property. The mathematics, Pruitt explained to anyone who would listen, were obvious. What Pruitt did not explain was that he had quietly reached out to families he knew. Families with daughters of appropriate age and presentation. Families who understood that a favorable match with Gideon Vale would create obligations, and that those obligations would be good for everyone involved, particularly for the families themselves, and particularly for Mayor Harlan Pruitt. The selection was set for a Saturday morning in late October, when the prairie wind had just enough bite to make everyone's cheeks red and their patience thin. 9 women arrived. They came from different corners of the territory, some by wagon, some by stage, one on horseback, and they ranged in age from 22 to 36. Most of them were genuinely hoping for something real. A few were there because their families had pushed them. All of them had made an effort, pressed dresses, clean hair, careful shoes. They stood outside the town hall in a loose line while Pruitt explained the situation to the gathered crowd with the practiced warmth of a man who had never in his life felt embarrassed by his own schemes. Elena Mercer arrived 40 minutes late. She hadn't intended to be part of the selection at all. She'd heard about it 3 weeks earlier in a town called Duskwater, 60 miles east, From a woman at a boarding house who'd explained that the arrangement included travel compensation and 3 weeks of room and board, regardless of outcome. Elena was down to her last $8. Her boots had a hole in the left sole that she'd been stuffing with folded paper since September, and 3 weeks of guaranteed shelter sounded like the most appealing thing she'd heard in a year. She signed her name. She got on the stage. She did not, at any point, consider the possibility of actually staying. The stage arrived late. A broken wheel outside of Milford had cost them most of the morning, and Elena climbed down into the dusty street, still working the road grime off her coat sleeve with her thumb. Her hair half escaped from its pin, her boots picking up the mud that rimmed the edge of the main road where a drainage ditch had overflowed sometime in the last rain. She looked up, saw the line of women and the gathered crowd, and felt the specific sinking feeling of a person who has arrived at a situation significantly more formal than anticipated. She considered, briefly, turning around. But $8 wasn't enough to get her anywhere useful, and she was tired. Not just from the road. Tired in the way that settles into your bones after too many years of moving and too many places that didn't work out, and too many mornings waking up in unfamiliar rooms, wondering if today was the day things finally started to make sense. She walked across the street and took the only open spot left in the line, at the far end, and she did not smile. Gideon Vale arrived on horseback, alone, which told you everything you needed to know about his feelings toward the event. He'd found out about the selection 4 days earlier when Pruitt had shown up at his gate with a letter and an expression of aggressive goodwill. The letter explained the arrangement in careful language that made it sound like an honor rather than an ambush. Pruitt had stood there in his good coat, grinning, while Gideon read the whole thing without changing his expression. "You went ahead and did this without asking me," Gideon had said. "I thought the surprise might—" "I don't like surprises." "Now, Gideon—" "I'll come Saturday," Gideon said, folding the letter. "Because not coming would cause more trouble than going, but you and I are going to have a conversation after." Pruitt had smiled the whole ride back to town, which told you something about how well he knew Gideon Vale. Now Gideon tied his horse at the rail and crossed the street toward the crowd, and people moved out of his way without being asked, which was a thing that happened around him not because of menace, but because of mass. He was a broad, weathered man who moved like someone accustomed to ground that fought back, and the crowd simply adjusted to him the way water adjusts to a stone dropped into it. He stopped at the edge of the gathered group and looked at the line of women. He did not look like a man who had come to make a choice. He looked like a man who had come to get something unpleasant finished. Pruitt appeared at his elbow, beaming. "Fine group of women, Gideon. Fine group. Why don't you take a walk down the line, get introduced?" "I can see them from here," Gideon said. He looked at the line in a way that was direct without being unkind. A surveying kind of look, the kind he probably used on fence lines and cattle. He went face by face, slow and deliberate, and the women who caught his gaze mostly managed to hold it, some with practiced smiles, some with carefully arranged expressions of confident calm. He reached the end of the line. He stopped. Elena Mercer was not smiling. She was standing with her arms loose at her sides and her chin level, not performing anything, just standing there. Looking back at him with the flat, tired patience of someone who had learned not to expect much from situations like this one. There was mud on her left boot, a tear at the hem of her sleeve, maybe 2 inches long, where the fabric had caught on something. Her hair had given up on its pin and was doing what it wanted, which was apparently trying to escape over her left ear. She looked like she'd had a rough week and wasn't sure the week was done being rough yet. Gideon studied her for a moment that stretched long enough to make the people nearest to them start shifting their weight. Then he said, "I'll take her." The silence that followed was the kind you could feel against your skin. Pruitt made a sound beside him that was almost a word. Several of the other women looked at each other. Someone in the crowd started to say something and then thought better of it. Elena stared at Gideon Vale with an expression that was difficult to read. Something between surprise and suspicion and the look of a person rapidly recalculating. "You don't know anything about me," she said. "No," Gideon agreed. "You walked right past 8 other women." "I did. They were all—" She stopped, started again. "They were trying." "Yes." "I wasn't." "I know." He held her gaze steady. "You coming or not?" It was, Elena would think later, the the least romantic thing anyone had ever said to her. And somehow, inexplicably, it was the only thing anyone had said to her in years that felt completely honest. She picked up her bag. The wagon ride out of Blackthorn Ridge took 3 hours, and they spent the first hour of it in complete silence. Not uncomfortable silence, exactly. Or maybe it was, and they were both just too tired to perform discomfort. Gideon drove. Elena sat on the bench beside him, her bag on her lap, watching the prairie roll past in the gray October light. The grass was going brown at the edges. A hawk circled something distant, impatient, far out to the east. "You don't have to make conversation," Gideon said, without looking at her. "I wasn't planning to," Elena said. Another stretch of quiet. 3 weeks, Elena said eventually. "That's the arrangement. Room and board for 3 weeks. After that, I'm free to go." Gideon's jaw moved slightly, like he was turning something over. "That's what Pruitt told you?" "That's what the letter said." "The letter Pruitt wrote?" "Yes." Gideon made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. 3 weeks, he said. "Sure." Elena looked at him sideways. "You have a problem with that?" "No problem. Because I'm not going to pretend—" "I don't want you to pretend anything," Gideon said. His voice was level, the way a man's voice goes level when he means exactly what he's saying and doesn't feel the need to emphasize it. "I didn't pick you because I wanted someone to pretend." Elena was quiet for a moment. "Why did you pick me?" He thought about it. "The others were there for something," he said. "You were just there." "That's not a compliment." "It wasn't meant to be one. Or an insult. It was just—" He seemed to run out of words, which appeared to be a condition he was accustomed to. He shrugged one shoulder. "It's what I saw." Elena looked back at the prairie. She didn't say anything, but something in her posture changed slightly, a degree or two of tension releasing that she probably wasn't aware of. They drove the rest of the way in silence, and it was a different kind of silence than the first hour. The ranch was not what she expected. Elena had built an image on the road of what a frontier cattleman's property would look like, weather-beaten and rough and slightly chaotic, the way men's spaces got when there was no one around to push back against entropy. She'd seen enough of those places. She knew the smell of them, the particular way dishes accumulated and floor corners gathered history, and the whole place took on the character of someone who'd stopped noticing. Gideon's ranch was not that. The main house was a long, low structure of dark timber and stone, serious-looking and plain, but the porch boards were sound underfoot, and the window shutters were properly hung, and every piece of fence visible from the gate was upright. The barn beyond it was large and well-maintained, the yard between the buildings clear of debris. It was not a beautiful place exactly. It was a disciplined place, a place that said, "Things here work because I make them work. And I don't have patience for things that don't work." Elena stepped down from the wagon and looked around. "It's cleaner than I thought it would be," she said. Gideon climbed down on his side, not looking at her. "That a problem?" "No, just—" She glanced at him. "You live here alone?" "Hands are in the bunkhouse. I'm in the main house." "How long have you been here alone?" He paused with his hand on the horse's neck, just a beat. 10 years. She didn't say anything to that, but she registered it. He showed her the room she'd be staying in. Small, clean, with a narrow window that looked out toward the eastern ridge. A wool blanket on the bed. A chest of drawers, empty. A hook on the back of the door. "Supper's at 6, he said from the doorway. "You don't have to help with it, but you're welcome to." "I'll help," she said, without knowing why she said it. He nodded and left. Elena set her bag on the chest of drawers and sat down on the edge of the bed. She looked at the wool blanket, at the clean floor, at the window and the gray light coming through it. She thought about the fact that she had not slept in a room this quiet in months. She pulled off her left boot and looked at the folded paper stuffed in the toe. She sat there for a minute holding the boot, and then she put it back on and went to find the kitchen. They cooked supper mostly without talking. Elena found her way around the kitchen in the methodical way she'd learned over years of making do in unfamiliar spaces. Opening cabinets carefully, taking stock, not asking for things she could find herself. There were potatoes. There was a cured ham hanging in the cold pantry. There were dried beans that had been soaking since morning, which meant Gideon had planned for supper before he left. which meant he was the kind of man who planned ahead for ordinary things, even when his day held extraordinary complications. She thought that was interesting. He came in from the barn while she was cutting potatoes and washed his hands at the basin without being asked, which she also noted. "You cook?" he said. "Well enough. Better than me, I'd guess." She looked at him. "You guess?" "I make food that keeps me going," he said. "That's not the same as cooking." Elena allowed herself the small pleasure of almost smiling. "What do you usually eat?" "Whatever's fastest." He dried his hands. "Beans, salt pork, sometimes eggs if the hens are in a good mood." "Are the hens often in a good mood?" He considered this with apparent seriousness. "Martha's reliable. The brown one near the fence is unreliable." "You named your chickens." "Just the ones worth knowing." He looked at her, and there was something in his face that might have been the ghost of humor. Nothing as obvious as a smile, just a slight shift in the set of his expression. "The rest are inventory." Elena laughed. It surprised her. A short, genuine sound that she hadn't heard from herself in long enough that it felt strange in her own throat. Gideon looked at her for a moment, then looked away and got the pan down from the hook. Supper was potatoes and ham and beans, and it was edible and warm, and they ate it at the kitchen table with the lamp between them and the October wind starting up outside, and the silence this time was the quietest kind. The kind that means two people are occupying the same space without fighting each other for it. "You're not going to ask me things," Elena said. It wasn't a question. "You'll tell me what you want to tell me," Gideon said. "Most people ask. Most people are looking for something specific when they ask." He looked at his plate. "I'm not looking for anything specific." Elena turned that over for a moment. "You really don't want a wife." "I didn't say that." "You said you don't like surprises, and Pruitt basically tricked you into this." "He did. And you still came. Coming to look is different from being ambushed." He set down his fork. "I've needed help. With the house. With things." He said it carefully, the way a man says something he's practiced admitting out loud. "I'm not good at asking for it." Elena looked at him steadily. "I'm not good at staying," she said. It was the most honest thing she'd said all day, and she knew it as she said it. "I know," Gideon said. "You told me." "And you still brought me here." "You were honest about it," he said. "I can work with honest." The lamp flickered in a draft from the window, and outside the wind moved through the dry grass with a sound like rushing water, and Elena sat with that answer for a long moment before she cleared the plates. The first week passed in the rhythms of work. Elena had no illusions about being useful from the start. She knew cattle from her childhood, but the particular operations of a ranch this size were different from anything she'd grown up around. She spent the first 3 days making mistakes. She mucked out the wrong stalls. She miscounted the feed. She latched the grain store wrong and spent an hour chasing a horse that had gotten into it, which required help from 2 of the ranch hands and ended with her standing in mud up to her ankles while a large gray mare regarded her with undisguised contempt. She was angry at herself in the way she usually was when she failed at things. Not loudly, but thoroughly, the kind of anger that goes quiet and hard. Gideon found her behind the barn, sitting on an upturned bucket, pulling mud off her boot with a stick. "You let the mare out," he said. "I noticed," she said. He leaned against the barn wall and said nothing. "You're not going to tell me what I did wrong?" "You already know what you did wrong." "I latched it the wrong way." "Yes." She looked up at him. "You're not—" She stopped. "Most people would say something." "I'm not most people." "Most men would," she said, which was more specific. He looked at her for a moment. "You came from somewhere where men said things when you made mistakes." It wasn't a question. It wasn't prying. It was just the flat, careful observation of a man who paid attention to information without demanding more of it than was offered. Elena looked back at her boot. "Yes," she said. "I did." Gideon nodded. He pushed off the wall. "The latch takes 2 full turns," he said. "It'll feel like it's done after 1, but it's not." He walked back toward the yard. Elena sat on the bucket for another minute. The mud was cold on her hands. The mare's face appeared around the edge of the barn door, watching her with the same contempt as before. "Oh, shut up," Elena said. The mare swished her tail and withdrew. The second week, things shifted. Not dramatically. Not in any way a person would notice from the outside. No grand declarations, no turning points sharp enough to name. Just the gradual accumulation of small things. Elena started waking up before Gideon. She'd make coffee and have it on the stove by the time he came in from the morning check, and she'd learned by the end of the first week that he took it black and strong and didn't want to talk until he'd had half a cup. She started repairing things she noticed without asking permission. A loose hinge on the kitchen cabinet, a section of porch board that flexed wrong, a window latch that stuck and needed refitting. She didn't announce these repairs or present them for approval. She just did them, and they were done. Gideon noticed all of it. She knew he noticed because he was that kind of man. He cataloged things, filed them somewhere behind those steady dark eyes, and occasionally responded to them later with something completely offhand, like she'd patched the window latch on Tuesday, and on Wednesday he'd come in with new oil for the hinges without being asked. It was a strange kind of conversation. But it was a conversation. One evening she found a box of her mother's old photographs in the lining of her bag. She'd forgotten they were there, tucked into a folded cloth that had been in the bag so long she'd stopped accounting for it. She sat on the edge of her bed and held them for a long time without looking at them directly. 3 photographs, faded and creased. A face she'd been running from for long enough that she'd half convinced herself she wasn't running. She heard Gideon in the kitchen. She heard the particular sound of him not quite sitting at the table, the creak of the chair he pulled out when he was tired and thinking. She put the photographs away without looking at them, but she didn't fold the cloth back over them, which was a small thing, but meant something. The second week also brought the first trouble from town. It came in the form of a woman named Dorothea Crane, who was Pruitt's wife's second cousin and had the particular talent of saying cruel things with an expression of warm concern. She arrived at the ranch on a Thursday in a buggy with her friend Clara Whitfield, and Elena answered the door because Gideon was out with the hands, and Dorothea looked her up and down with a smile that contained no warmth whatsoever. "We just wanted to check in," Dorothea said sweetly. "Everyone in town has been so worried about Gideon. It's such an unusual situation." "He seems fine," Elena said. "Of course he does. Men always seem fine." Dorothea's eyes moved past Elena into the house with undisguised curiosity. "We heard you never actually intended to stay. Is that true?" Elena looked at her. "Where did you hear that?" "Oh, word gets around." Clara offered a sympathetic tilt of her head that Elena found immediately exhausting. "No one blames you, of course. It's a hard life out here, not what everyone's suited for." "We're just concerned," Dorothea pressed, "that Gideon might not understand the situation fully. He's a proud man. He might not know he's being—" She paused for the pleasure of the pause. "Taken advantage of." Elena kept her face still. She had a great deal of practice keeping her face still. "Gideon understands the situation," she said. "We were clear with each other from the beginning." "Well," Dorothea smiled, "that's reassuring." The way she said it made it clear she found it not reassuring at all. "We'll leave you to it then. Do give Gideon our regards." They left. Elena watched the buggy until it was past the gate. Then she went back inside and stood in the kitchen for a moment with her hands flat on the table. She thought, there it is. She'd known it was coming. She'd known from the minute she stepped off that stage and into the mess of Pruitt's arrangement that the town would eventually have things to say, and most of those things would be aimed at her, and they would contain enough truth to sting properly. She went and found the stuck drawer in the front room that she'd been meaning to fix for 3 days, and she worked on it until it opened clean, and she was still working on it when Gideon came in at sundown. He read her face the way she'd already learned he read most things, quietly, thoroughly, and without asking. "Dorothea Crane?" he said. Elena looked up. "How did you know?" "Saw her buggy in the road this morning. She was heading this direction." He went to the basin and washed his hands. "What'd she say?" "That you might not understand I wasn't planning to stay." Gideon dried his hands. He didn't look especially bothered. "She say anything else?" "Variations on the same theme." "Right." He folded the towel. "She does that." "She's not wrong, though," Elena said. She didn't know exactly why she said it. Habit, maybe. The long-practiced reflex of a woman who had learned that disagreeing first was safer than being surprised by someone else's agreement. "I did come here for shelter and travel money." That was the truth. I know. Gideon turned and looked at her directly. I knew that when I said I'd take you. And it doesn't… Elena. He said her name with a kind of flat patience, like a man setting something down carefully. If I had a problem with it, I'd have said so on the road. She looked at him. He looked back. His expression was the same as it always was, careful, present, not performing anything. Okay, she said. Okay, he said. He went to see about the horses, and Elena finished fixing the drawer, and neither of them said anything else about it that evening. But something had shifted again, some tectonic thing deep beneath the surface of how they occupied the same space, and she felt it without being able to name it. The third week, she stopped counting days. She hadn't realized she'd been doing it until she noticed she wasn't anymore. She'd been keeping a quiet internal tally since the moment she stepped off the wagon. 18 days left, 15 days left, 9 days, the way a person counts down a sentence. And somewhere in the third week, between repairing the porch step and helping Gideon dose a sick calf, and the evening she sat on the fence rail watching the sunset burn the ridgeline copper, and he stood 10 feet away watching the same thing without saying a word, the tally stopped. She didn't know what to do with that. She sat with it the way you sit with a thing you're not sure is good news yet. The hands had started warming to her. Slowly, the way frontier men warm to anything, through work and practical demonstration rather than conversation or charm. A young hand named Pete, who was maybe 20 and had the earnest energy of someone who'd been raised right and hadn't been knocked around enough yet to lose it, had started asking her questions about the sick calf, which she answered honestly, and from there a tentative working relationship had grown where she occasionally didn't feel like a complete outsider on the property she was supposedly living on. You good with animals? Pete told her one afternoon with the simple declarative confidence of a 20-year-old who thought he was saying something original. I grew up with them, Elena said. Where? East, long time ago. He had the grace not to push. You staying, you think? Elena looked at the calf, which was eating again, which was a good sign. I don't know, she said honestly. Pete nodded like this was a reasonable answer. Boss seems… He stopped. Seems what? Different, Pete said carefully. Since you got here. Not different like bad different, just… He searched for words in the particular helpless way of young men trying to articulate something they can feel but not quite name. Like he's not the only person in the house, if that makes sense. Elena looked at the calf. It makes sense, she said. She thought about that for a long time afterward, about what it meant to be the only person in a house, about how long a person could run a 12,000-acre operation with 14 employees and still be, functionally, alone. She thought about her own version of that, the different alone, the one that came from moving instead of staying, from making sure you never settled long enough to give anyone the chance to leave you first. Different shapes, same hole. She went to bed that night and lay in the dark and listened to the wind in the grass outside her window and thought about the photographs still sitting unfolded in her bag. And she did not sleep well, but she slept. The end of the third week came quietly. There was no ceremony to it, no formal announcement, no moment where the calendar clicked over and she was expected to appear at the gate with her bag. That wasn't how the actual arrangement worked, and she'd understood that for a while. Pruitt's letter had said 3 weeks in the language of something with an obvious conclusion, but the obvious conclusion had always been a fiction. A frame Pruitt had built to make the whole thing seem less permanent than it was, to give Gideon the appearance of choice and her the appearance of an exit, when in fact the structure of the arrangement depended on someone deciding to stay. She sat at the kitchen table on the morning of the 22nd day with her coffee and thought about the fact that she hadn't packed her bag. She thought about the fact that she knew where Gideon kept the spare lamp oil and which fence panel on the north side was due for replacement, and that Martha the hen was more reliable in the morning than the afternoon, and that the gray mare's name was apparently Judith, and her contempt was performative rather than genuine. She thought about the fact that she hadn't thought about leaving in more than a week. Gideon came in from the barn and poured his coffee and sat down across from her, and they drank in the morning quiet with the early light coming through the kitchen window, and neither of them said anything for a while. My 3 weeks are up, Elena said eventually. Gideon held his cup in both hands and looked at the window. I haven't packed. A beat. I noticed. Another beat of silence. I'm not promising anything, she said. I don't know how to. I'm not good at. You said that before. I know. I'm saying it again. He looked at her then, straight on with those quiet dark eyes that had a way of seeing things she wasn't sure she'd said out loud. I'm not asking for a promise, he said. What are you asking for? He thought about it for a moment. Another day, he said. Same as yesterday. It was so simple it almost made her angry, but she understood it. She understood it in the deep, bone-tired way of a person who has built elaborate systems of exit and self-protection and is exhausted by all of them, and who recognizes in someone else the same careful, quiet structure, the same fortress dressed up as a life. Another day. Same as yesterday. She could do that. Okay, she said. She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup, and the morning light came in through the window. And outside the prairie stretched on forever in every direction, flat and enormous and indifferent, the way the frontier was, and for the first time in years, Elena Mercer did not feel small inside of it. She felt like a person who had, despite everything, arrived somewhere. What she didn't know yet was how hard the town was about to work to take that away from her. The gossip reached its full velocity about 2 weeks after Elena stopped counting days. It started the way gossip always starts in small towns. Not with one person saying one thing, but with a dozen people each adding a small piece, each piece just plausible enough to stick, until the whole construction had the weight and shape of fact, even though it was built from nothing more substantial than speculation and bruised feelings. Dorothea Crane had done her work thoroughly. By the time Elena walked into the dry goods store on a Wednesday morning to pick up lamp oil and flour, she could feel it in the room before anyone said a word. The woman behind the counter, Agnes Poole, mid-50s, with the particular stillness of someone who has just stopped a conversation, smiled at her with the wide, effortful smile of a person who has been talking about you and is now performing innocence. 2 other women in the store found sudden interest in bolts of fabric they'd probably already examined that morning. The bell above the door had barely stopped ringing before the silence took on its specific texture, thick and knowing and slightly mean. Elena set her list on the counter and waited. Lamp oil, Agnes said, already reaching. And flour. Anything else? That's all. Agnes gathered the items with brisk efficiency, and Elena watched the price get added up, and the 2 women near the fabric kept their backs carefully turned, and somewhere in the silence between the flour hitting the counter and the coins changing hands, Elena heard one of them say something in a low voice that contained the words, 3 weeks, and shelter, and poor Gideon. She picked up her purchases. Morning, she said to the room in general, and walked out. She stood on the porch for a moment in the cold air, her jaw tight, looking at the empty street. The sky was heavy and gray. They'd been threatening snow for a week without delivering it. And the wind off the ridge had a real bite to it now, November settling in proper. She'd been on the ranch for just over a month. She walked back to the wagon, loaded her things, and drove home. She didn't tell Gideon about it that evening, not because she was hiding it. She'd long since given up the habit of managing information for other people's comfort, but because she wasn't sure what to say that would be useful. The gossip was happening. It had been happening for a while. Saying it out loud wouldn't change it. What she didn't account for was that Gideon already knew. He found out from Pete, who had heard it from the blacksmith's apprentice, who had heard it from someone whose name Pete couldn't remember, which was usually how these chains worked in Blackthorn Ridge. The specific version that reached Gideon was that Elena Mercer had admitted to multiple people that she never intended to stay, that she was using his household for food and lodging while she saved money to leave in the spring, and that the whole arrangement was something she'd described as temporary shelter, which was close enough to what she'd actually said that it had the particular sting of truth that's been stripped of its context. Pete told him on Thursday morning while they were checking the north fence line, which was probably not the moment Pete had planned for the conversation, but which happened because Pete was 20 and didn't always understand that sometimes information should wait for better terrain. People are saying she's just, running out the clock, Pete said, in the cautious voice of a young man who's not sure whether he's being helpful or starting something. Until spring, Gideon kept walking the fence line. He checked a post that had loosened in the last rain, tested it with his hand, made a mental note. Who's saying it? Mostly, town people. Pete hesitated. Mrs. Crane. Right. Gideon checked another post. Anything else? Pete looked at him with the expression of someone who is prepared for a different reaction. Doesn't it bother you? Gideon looked down the fence line, calculating. She told me herself, he said, first day. She wasn't planning to stay. Pete blinked. She did? On the wagon. She was clear about it. And you just accepted that? Gideon looked at Pete with the particular patience of a 39-year-old man for a 20-year-old one. She was the only honest person at that whole arrangement, he said. I'm not going to hold honesty against her. Pete thought about this for a moment. Yeah, but she's still... is she staying because people are... Pete. Yeah? Post on the far end needs resetting, Gideon said. Get the tools. Pete went to get the tools, and Gideon stood in the cold morning looking south toward where the ranch house was barely visible through the tree line, and he thought about the things he hadn't said to Pete, which were also things he hadn't let himself think too clearly about, because thinking too clearly about them would require admitting that the situation had become something different from what he told himself it was. He was not Gideon Vale, a man given to self-deception, but he had his limits. He picked up his end of the post and got back to work. That evening, he came in and ate supper across from Elena, and the kitchen was warm and the lamp was lit, and she had fixed the latch on the cold pantry door that had been sticking for 2 years, and when she passed him the bread, she did it without looking up from what she was reading, the way people do when they've gotten past the stage of performing ordinary things and have started just doing them. He watched her for a moment. Town's talking, he said. She looked up. I know. Doesn't seem to be slowing down. It won't, she said. Not unless something bigger happens to talk about. And in a town like this, something bigger might take a while. You're not worried about it. She set the book down. I've had people talk about me before, she said. It usually means they don't have anything more interesting to do. The things they're saying are mostly true, Elena said. That's the thing about it, Gideon. I did come here for shelter. I wasn't planning to stay. I said that. She met his eyes steadily. The part they're leaving out is that you knew that and brought me here anyway. He held her gaze. They're going to say you're using me. They already are. And you don't. That doesn't bother you? She was quiet for a moment. It bothers me more than I'm showing, she said, which was more honest than she'd meant to be. But there's nothing I can do about what people think. I can only be what I am and do what I do. Gideon looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked back up. What are you? He asked. Not unkindly, genuinely. Elena stared at him. It was a strange question, asked simply, without malice or challenge. And it hit her somewhere unexpected because it was a question she hadn't been asked in a long time and had mostly stopped asking herself. Tired, she said finally. Mostly just tired. He nodded slowly, like that was an answer he understood from the inside. Yeah, he said. Me too. Me? They finished supper and cleared the plates, and Elena washed and Gideon dried, which had become their ritual without either of them deciding it, and the wind pressed against the windows and neither of them said anything more about town. But the conversation sat between them quietly, like something that had changed the light in the room without changing anything you could point to. The trouble with Pruitt came the following week. The mayor arrived at the gate on a gray Monday morning in his town buggy, which meant he'd made the 3-hour trip specifically for this conversation, which meant it was serious, or he wanted Gideon to think it was serious. With Pruitt, the two were often indistinguishable. Elena saw him coming from the kitchen window while she was putting up preserves from the last of the root cellar apples, and she had about 2 minutes to decide whether to disappear or stay put before Gideon came in from the yard and glanced out the window himself. Pruitt, he said. I see him. Gideon's face did the thing it did when he was thinking through something unpleasant, a kind of stillness, jaw slightly set, eyes going somewhere else briefly before coming back. You don't have to be here for this. Elena thought about Dorothea Crane and her concerned smile and the two women in the dry goods store and their carefully turned backs. She thought about the way the town had already decided its version of the story and how much of that version was going to be told differently if she wasn't in the room. I'll stay, she said. Gideon gave her a brief look, not arguing, just registering, and went to open the door. Pruitt came in with his hat in his hands and his negotiating face on, which was a specific expression Elena had categorized within about 30 seconds of their first meeting. open, warm, slightly apologetic, designed to make you feel that whatever was coming was as regrettable to him as it was to you. It was a very good face. She imagined he'd practiced it. "Gideon," Pruitt said warmly. Then with a slightly more complex warmth, "Miss Mercer." "Sit down, Harlan," Gideon said. He did not offer coffee. Pruitt sat. He set his hat on his knee and spent a moment looking at the table with an expression of man who has come with difficult news. "I'll be direct," he said, which Elena had found was always what people said just before they were roundabout. "Please," Gideon said. "There's been talk," Pruitt began, "in town. People are concerned. The way the selection was structured, there were expectations. Not just yours and Miss Mercer's, but community expectations. The other women who came traveled significant distances. Their families—" "What do you want, Harlan?" Gideon said. Pruitt met his eyes. "I think it would help things considerably if the situation were formalized, more quickly than originally discussed." Elena set down her spoon. "You want us to get married," she said. Pruitt turned to her with the expression of a man who has been spoken to by the piece of furniture he was trying to negotiate around. "I want the community to have clarity about whether or not I'm a kept woman," Elena said. Pruitt's mouth opened. "Because that's what you mean," she continued, in the flat, even tone she'd learned kept her voice from doing things she'd regret. "The community's concern isn't about the other women. It's about what story they're telling about what I'm doing here and whether your arrangement produced anything respectable enough to justify itself." Pruitt looked at Gideon, who was looking at Elena with an expression that was difficult to read but was not, notably, an expression of disagreement. "Miss Mercer," Pruitt said carefully, "I understand this is a delicate—" "It's not delicate," she said. "It's straightforward. You want him to marry me fast enough to shut down the gossip. And you want that because the gossip reflects on your arrangement, and your arrangement reflects on you." She picked her spoon back up. "That's not a community concern. That's a Harlan Pruitt concern." The kitchen was very quiet. Pruitt looked at Gideon again. Gideon had his arms crossed, and the particular expression of a man who is watching someone else do something he would have gotten around to himself eventually. "She's right," Gideon said. Pruitt blinked. "Gideon!" "About what she said." Gideon's voice was level. "You're here for your reasons, not ours. If and when Elena and I decide to formalize anything, it won't be timed to your political calendar." Pruitt sat with that for a moment. The negotiating face shifted, recalibrated. "The thing is," he said in a slightly lower voice, "there are people, families, who feel their daughters were passed over, publicly, and they have feelings about that. And those feelings have a way of becoming pressure," Gideon said. "I was going to say problems." "Same thing." Pruitt nodded slowly. "I'm trying to manage this for you, Gideon. I'm trying to keep it from becoming—" "I don't need you to manage it," Gideon said. "I need you to stop involving yourself in it." He stood up, which was a thing that on Gideon Vale communicated considerably more than simply standing up. "I'll walk you to your buggy." Pruitt went. He put his hat on his head and he followed Gideon to the door, and he paused briefly and looked at Elena with an expression she couldn't entirely read, part calculation, part something that was almost genuine uncertainty, and then he left. Elena sat at the table and listened to the muffled sound of their voices outside, not making out the words, just the cadence of them, Pruitt's quick and persuasive and Gideon's infrequent and final. She picked up her spoon and looked at the preserves cooling in their jars, and thought about all the reasons a person might stay somewhere, and all the reasons a person might leave, and how the distance between those two things had gotten complicated in a way she hadn't fully accounted for. Gideon came back in. He stood near the door for a moment, not quite in the room yet. "He's going to keep trying," Elena said. "Probably. Are you worried about it?" Gideon crossed the room and sat down. He poured himself the coffee Elena had made an hour ago, which was cold, and drank it without commenting on the temperature, which was the kind of thing he did that she'd stopped noticing and then started noticing again because of what it said about him. "Pruitt's a problem I know how to manage," he said. "He makes noise until the noise costs him something. Then he stops." "What if what it costs him is you?" Gideon looked at her. "What do you mean?" "I mean," she chose her words carefully. "He arranged this because he wants something from you. Your influence, your land, your vote for whatever's coming with the county. If this situation keeps causing him problems and he can't manage it, he might decide it's not worth the trouble. He might flip, start supporting whatever makes you look bad instead of whatever makes you look good. Gideon was quiet for a moment, and she could see him thinking through it, which was a thing she'd started to find genuinely interesting. Watching him process information, the way it moved behind his eyes before it came out in words. He wasn't a quick answer man. He ran things around in his head until he was sure. "That's a good point," he said. "I'm occasionally right about things." Something crossed his face. "You're right about more than occasionally." He set down his cup. "I don't want you thinking this situation is dangerous for you. If Pruitt gets difficult, I can handle difficult." "I know you can," he said. "I'm saying I'd handle it first." She looked at him for a moment. There was something in the way he said it that was simple and direct without any performance of chivalry. Not, "I'll protect you," not, "You don't have to worry," just the flat declaration of a man saying what he would do as a fact. She found she didn't want to argue with it the way she normally would have. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he said. She went back to the preserves, and he went back to the ranch, and neither of them said anything about what had happened in the kitchen, but she thought about it all afternoon. The problem was that she'd started thinking about a lot of things all afternoon. This was new. She was not by habit a person who let her mind settle. She'd spent years keeping it busy with practicality. What was the next town, the next job, the next arrangement, the next thing that needed doing? Settling her mind on a single place meant settling her mind on all the things she'd left behind in that place, and she had an extensive catalog of things she'd left behind. It was easier to keep moving. But November had come in serious and cold, and the prairie in the late afternoon light had a way of expanding until it was the whole world, and you could stand on the porch and look at it and feel something that was either smallness or peace, depending on where you were inside yourself. Elena was finding, cautiously, that it was starting to feel like the second one. She didn't like knowing that. It felt precarious, like standing on ground you haven't tested. The letter arrived on a Friday. It came with the weekly mail delivery that one of the hands brought from town, a cream-colored envelope with handwriting Elena recognized from the particular backward slant of the letters, a handwriting she'd spent 8 years not seeing and had partly convinced herself she'd forgotten how to read. Her name on the front, her brother's handwriting. She stood in the yard for a long moment, holding the letter, her thumb on the edge of the seal. The cold was serious now, her breath visible in the air, and she could hear the distant sounds of the ranch going about its afternoon business. Cattle sounds, horse sounds, the clang of something metal from the barn's direction. Normal sounds, present sounds. She went inside and put the letter on the chest of drawers in her room and looked at it for a while and then went and made supper. Gideon noticed, because Gideon noticed things. He didn't say anything directly. That wasn't his way. But after supper, when Elena stood at the kitchen window washing up and he was at the table going over the feed accounts, he said without looking up, "You don't have to tell me." She stopped. "Tell you what?" "Whatever's in the letter." She turned around. "You saw it?" "It was in your hand when you came in this afternoon." He made a notation in the accounts. "You didn't look happy." "I haven't opened it." He looked up at that. "I recognize the handwriting," she said. That was enough for one afternoon. Gideon held her gaze for a moment, and she could see the question he wasn't asking, which was the question she'd been asking herself since she put the letter on the chest of drawers. "My brother," she said. "We haven't spoken in 3 years." Gideon set down his pen. He didn't do anything terrible," she said quickly, because she could feel the explanation wanting to come out in a way that was bigger than she was ready for. "It's just, when everything fell apart, he took sides, and the side he took wasn't mine, and I was already leaving, and I just kept leaving." Gideon was quiet. "I don't know what he wants," she said. Could be anything." "Could be nothing bad," Gideon said. "Could be." She turned back to the window. Outside, the night was black and enormous, the stars beginning to appear one by one. "I'm not good at family," she said, in case that wasn't already obvious. "You're better at it than you think," Gideon said. She laughed, the short, slightly startled laugh she produced when something caught her off guard. "You've known me 6 weeks." "6 weeks is enough time to see things," he said. She stood with that for a moment, water going cold on her hands. "What do you see?" she asked. She didn't mean to ask it. It came out before she'd made the decision to say it, The way things sometimes did now, things she would have kept behind her teeth a few months ago. Gideon was quiet for long enough that she almost told him to forget it. Then he said, "Someone who fixes things." She waited. "Not people," he said. "Or not starting with people. You fix the hinge, the latch, the board. You fix the practical thing first. Like if you can make the space work right, the rest might follow." Elena stood very still. "You do that with everything," he said, "including yourself, I think. You try to fix what you can get your hands on, and you don't touch what you can't. And that works okay, except—" He stopped. "Except what?" she said quietly. "Except some things need to be touched to get better," he said, "even if you can't fix them." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the wind moved across the land with the low, sustained sound of something that has never needed to be anything other than itself. Elena dried her hands. She did it slowly, the way you do when you're buying yourself a moment. "I'll read the letter tonight," she said. Gideon picked his pen back up. "Okay." She went to her room and she sat on the edge of the bed and she opened the envelope with the careful deliberateness of someone who knows the thing inside might change something and has decided to look at it anyway. Her brother's handwriting filled 2 pages. She read it slowly, once, and then again. He was in Milford, the town she'd come through on the stage, 60 miles east. Had been for a year. He'd heard, through the kind of channels that move information across the frontier like water finding its level, that she'd ended up in Blackthorn Ridge. He wrote that he wasn't asking her for anything. He wrote that he knew he'd gotten things wrong 3 years ago, and he wasn't sure how to fix that, but he was starting with saying it. He wrote that he had 2 kids now, a boy and a girl, 4 and 2, which meant he'd had them around the time everything fell apart, which she hadn't known. He wrote their names, James and Clara had their mother's hair, and James had the family stubbornness, which was not a quality they distributed sparingly. He wrote, "I'm not asking you to come back to anything. I just wanted you to know where I am." Elena sat with the letter on her knee for a long time. The lamp was burning low, and the wind was pushing at the window, and the night was thoroughly settled in, and she thought about stubbornness as a family inheritance, and about the photograph still sitting in her bag, and about her brother at 26 with 2 small children and something that sounded like regret in his handwriting. She thought about Gideon saying some things need to be touched to get better. She thought about James and Clara, whose ages she was already doing arithmetic on, and how the arithmetic meant they'd existed all this time while she was moving, little lives accumulating experiences and features, and the particular sturdiness of children who are being looked after, and she hadn't known. She folded the letter carefully and put it on top of the photographs in her bag, because that was where it belonged, with the things she'd stopped running past and started carrying. She blew out the lamp. She lay in the dark and thought about how different 3 years felt from the outside of them, and how the inside of 3 years, the actual living of them, the sequence of days and roads and bad decisions and necessary ones, expanded into something much larger than the number suggested. 3 years was long enough to lose everything and start from nothing and travel across a territory and land, somehow, in a room that smelled like cedar and clean wool on a ranch in the middle of the frontier, with a man who named his reliable chickens and thought she fixed things. She didn't sleep for a while. When she did, she dreamed about a fence line stretching further than she could see, and she was walking it, checking each post, and they were all solid, and the grass on both sides was the same, and there was nowhere in particular she was trying to get to. She woke up to the smell of coffee and the sound of Gideon already out in the yard, and the morning was gray and cold and entirely normal, and something in her chest felt like it had shifted about half an inch in a direction she hadn't been expecting. She got up. She made herself useful. She did not mention the letter, and Gideon did not ask. And between the 2 of them, that was not a silence, but a kind of courtesy. The grown-up, respectful kind that means, "I'm here when you're ready," and not a moment before. What neither of them knew, drinking their morning coffee in the familiar kitchen quiet, was that Pruitt had not stopped with his visit. He was still out there making calculations, and the calculation he'd landed on was worse than pressure. It was a plan, quiet, systematic, and aimed precisely at the thing he understood was most at risk, Elena's willingness to stay. Pruitt's plan turned out to be simpler and meaner than either of them had anticipated. He didn't come back to the ranch. He didn't send letters or make announcements or do anything loud enough to be confronted directly. What he did was quieter and considerably more effective. He started talking to the women who had been passed over at the selection, specifically to their families, specifically to the fathers and brothers who had the particular frontier combination of wounded pride and available time. He reminded them, in the gentle circling way he had, that their daughters had made the trip in good faith, that Gideon Vale's choice had been an insult dressed up as a preference, that the woman he'd chosen had admitted to multiple witnesses that she had never intended to honor the arrangement. He didn't tell anyone to do anything. He just planted things and stepped back, and the things he planted were the kind with deep roots and a long growing season. Elena found out about it on a Tuesday from Pete, who heard it from the blacksmith's apprentice, who had been in the feed store when two men from out of territory were asking about the roads to the Vale Ranch. The men had the look, apparently, of people with a purpose that wasn't friendly. The blacksmith's apprentice had thought to mention this because he was fundamentally a decent person and Pete was someone he knew. Pete told Gideon first. Then he told Elena, because Pete had developed a loyalty that didn't distinguish between them as cleanly as the hierarchy of the ranch might have suggested. Elena received this information in the yard while she was splitting wood, which she had taken to doing in the late afternoon because it required the kind of focused physical effort that left no room for anything else. She set down the axe and looked at Pete. 2 men, she said. Maybe more. Just 2 that he saw. When? Yesterday. They'd been asking around in town since the morning. She picked up the axe. She set another log. She split it. You tell Gideon, she said. He's in the barn. I told him first, then came to find you. Good, she said. Go back to what you were doing. Pete lingered. Elena. I'm fine, Pete. He went. She split 3 more logs, watching the wood come apart along its grain, and thought about Pruitt in his good coat and his negotiating face, and the particular calculation that had led him here, the understanding that Gideon himself was too solid to move, so the lever was her. Make her feel threatened. Make her feel unwelcome. Make the ranch feel like a place where staying would cost her more than leaving. It was not a bad plan. It was the plan a person made when they understood how frightened people work. She put down the axe and went to the barn. Gideon was at the workbench, and he turned when she came in, and his expression told her he had already been thinking through it. The barn held the smell of hay and animals and old timber, and the light through the gaps in the siding came in long and low, the late afternoon trying its best against the November cold. You heard, he said. Pete told me. He turned back to the bench. He was working on a piece of harness that needed restitching, the kind of detailed work he did when he needed to keep his hands busy while his head ran elsewhere. Probably nothing, he said, which was the thing he said when it was probably something. Probably something, Elena said. He set the harness down. I'll put a hand on the gate nights. That's not going to stop it if they're serious. Nothing will stop it if they're serious, he said, in the flat, honest way he had. But it's a step. She stood just inside the barn door, arms crossed against the cold, looking at him. He was wearing the worn canvas jacket he wore for work, the one with the frayed left cuff that he hadn't bothered to repair, and he looked, in the low afternoon light, exactly like what he was. A man who had been holding a piece of land together by force of will for a decade, who was accustomed to problems but not to problems that came at him sideways through other people. This is because of me, she said. It's because of Pruitt. It started because of me. Elena. He looked at her steadily. Everything that's happened since October started because Pruitt decided to arrange something without asking. You walking in late with mud on your boots didn't cause this. I know that, she said. That's not what I meant. He waited. I meant... She stopped. She tried again. If I weren't here, this would all go away. He'd have nothing to use. If you weren't here, Gideon said slowly, I'd still be dealing with Pruitt. Different shape, same problem. He's been trying to find a way into my business for 3 years. Elena looked at the floor. The barn cat, a gray tabby with one torn ear, named after nothing because Gideon hadn't bothered, appeared from the shadows and sat down near her feet and regarded her with the uninvested calm of a cat that has observed a great deal of human foolishness and been impressed by none of it. I don't want to be the reason you have trouble, she said, and saying it out loud made something ache in her chest, the specific ache of a thing that matters more than you were planning on letting it matter. Gideon picked up the harness again, turned it over in his hands. Tell me something, he said. She looked up. The morning after you read that letter from your brother, you came out and you made coffee, and you fixed the gap under the cold pantry door, and you helped Pete with the lame horse, and you didn't say a word about any of it. You just did the day. Yes, she said carefully. That's not the thing a person does when they're planning to leave, he said. He said it without drama. The way he said most things, as an observation, a fact he'd worked out and was now reporting. That's the thing a person does when the place feels like theirs. The barn was very quiet. Outside, the wind moved across the property with its long, indifferent sound. Elena felt the ache in her chest expand into something larger and less comfortable. I'm not good at this, she said. I know. I mean, I'm actually not good at it. I don't have a great record. Neither do I. She looked at him. You've never even tried. That's a record, he said, and something in his face shifted just slightly, the ghost of something wry and self-aware, and she felt the particular helpless feeling of a person who is losing an argument they were making against their own interests. She uncrossed her arms. She leaned against the barn door frame and looked out at the yard, where the last of the afternoon light was going bronze across the frost-bitten grass. I'll write back to my brother, she said. It was not what she'd been talking about, and it was entirely what she'd been talking about. Tomorrow. Gideon looked at her briefly and then looked back at the harness. Good, he said. That was the whole conversation. But it was also not the whole conversation, and they both knew it, and neither of them needed it to be anything more than what it was. The men came 3 days later. There were 3 of them, not 2. The blacksmith's apprentice had missed one, or a third had joined along the road. They came in the late morning on a Wednesday, when the sky was the flat white of a serious November sky that hasn't decided yet whether it's going to snow. Elena was at the kitchen window when she saw them come through the gate, and she watched the way they rode, close together, unhurried, the specific casual pace of people who want to appear less deliberate than they are. She went to find Gideon without running, because running would tell her something about how scared she was, and she didn't want to know that yet. He was at the north end of the yard talking to an older hand named Cass, and he saw her face before she'd said anything and said something brief to Cass and came across the yard to her. 3 of them, she said, through the gate. His jaw set. He looked toward the front of the property, then at her. Go inside. I'd rather not. Elena. I'd rather not, she said again, and something in her voice was steady in a way she was genuinely surprised by. This is about me being here. I'm not going to stand in the kitchen while you deal with it. He looked at her for a long moment, the careful reading look, and then he nodded, once, and they walked together to the front of the yard where the 3 men had pulled up on their horses and were waiting with the patient, deliberate posture of a calculated entrance. The man in front was probably 50, broad and weathered in the way of men who've worked the frontier for decades, with a thick gray mustache and eyes that were more intelligent than his presentation suggested. Elena didn't know him. She didn't know any of them. Vale, the man said. Not hostile exactly. Measured. Hobson, Gideon said. He knew him then. You're a long way from your territory. Heard you had something that belonged to someone else, the man said. His eyes moved to Elena, and the look was appraising in the way of a man deciding what something is worth. And Elena kept her face still, and her hands loose at her sides, and met the look without flinching. I don't have anything that belongs to anyone else, Gideon said. Hobson shifted in his saddle. My brother's daughter came out here in good faith, a month and a half ago. Made a long trip, and you walked right past her. That's true, Gideon said. She's been humiliated. She went home, she's fine. She's not fine, Hobson said, and for just a moment something real moved across his face, actual feeling, beneath the performance of grievance. She's 24 years old, and she stood in a line in front of a whole town and got walked past. You know what that does to a girl? A beat of silence. Elena had not expected the conversation to go this way. She had expected blunt threat, direct intimidation, the kind of confrontation that was simple to classify. This was something with more texture. I'm sorry she was hurt, Gideon said. His voice was not unkind. I am. But I didn't choose who was in that line. Pruitt arranged it. If your brother has a grievance, it's with him. Pruitt says different. Pruitt says whatever protects Pruitt, Gideon said. Hobson's eyes moved back to Elena. Word is she was never planning to stay, just using your house. Word is wrong, Gideon said. Then why'd she say it? She said she wasn't planning to stay before she knew what was here, Elena said. Both men looked at her. Hobson with something between surprise and assessment. Gideon with the brief, still expression of a man who was going to let this happen and see where it went. What does that mean? Hobson said. It means I came here for shelter, and I said so honestly, and I've stayed because I chose to, she said. She kept her voice level. Your niece was humiliated by the situation, not by Gideon's choice. The situation was Pruitt's. The man who told you to come here is the same man who put your niece in a line in front of a crowd in the first place. Hobson was very still. He sent you, she said, or he said enough that you came. Either way, you're here doing his work for him, and whatever happens on this property today, Pruitt goes home to a warm house, and your niece is still hurt, and you've ridden 3 hours to stand in someone else's yard. The silence stretched. The gray sky hung over all of them with its indecisive weight. One of the horses shifted and blew. She's got a point, said one of the other men quietly, to no one in particular. Hobson looked at the man who'd spoken, then back at Elena, then at Gideon. Something was happening behind his eyes. The recalculation of a man who has arrived at a situation with a plan and found the plan is built on wrong information. It wasn't comfortable to watch, but it was honest. You planning to do right by her? He said to Gideon. The woman. My business with Elena is between us, Gideon said. That's where it'll stay. That's not an answer. It's the only answer you're going to get, Gideon said, because the question isn't yours to ask. He let that sit for a moment. You want to water your horses before you ride back? You're welcome to. Hobson sat with the offer for a long moment. Then he made a sound that wasn't quite agreement and wasn't quite retreat, but was somewhere in the middle. The sound of a man letting something go that he'd been carrying for longer than he wanted to. He turned his horse toward the water trough at the side of the yard. The other two followed. Elena stood beside Gideon, and neither of them said anything. Her hands had been shaking slightly, and she'd managed not to let that show, she thought, though she was less sure now that the tension had dropped. The cold air felt very sharp in her lungs. After a few minutes, the three men watered their horses and rode back out through the gate without another word, and the property absorbed the silence they left behind the way land does. Just taking it in, going on. Gideon looked at her. Your hands are shaking, he said. They stopped, she said, which was mostly true. He looked at her for a moment longer. That was well done, he said. It might not hold. Pruitt will just find another angle. It'll hold for a while, he said. Hobson's not stupid. He'll think about what you said. She exhaled slowly. I could use coffee, she said. I'll make it, he said, which was the first time he'd made that offer, and they walked back to the house together through the sharp November air, and the day went on. Pruitt's next angle took less than a week. This time it wasn't men on horses. It was a letter delivered through the official post with the town seal on it, addressed to Elena Mercer at the Vale Ranch, and written in the careful legal language of someone who has consulted with someone who knows how legal language works. The letter informed Elena that the Frontier Bride Selection Program, as administered by the office of Mayor Harlan Pruitt, had specific terms of participation that she had agreed to when she signed her name in Duskwater. Those terms required either formal marriage within 60 days or return of the travel and accommodation funds provided. The 60-day period had nearly elapsed. The sum owed in the event of non-marriage was $37. Elena read the letter twice, sitting at the kitchen table, and then she set it down flat on the table and looked at it with the particular focused calm of a woman who is deciding whether to be frightened or furious and has landed on furious. $37 was a sum she did not have. She had $12 to her name, which Gideon did not know, because she hadn't needed him to know. She sat with the letter for a long time. Gideon found it when he came in for lunch. She'd left it on the table, partly because she hadn't decided what to do, and partly because she'd passed the point in this particular relationship of hiding things from him on principle. He read it standing at the table without sitting down, and his face went through a very controlled sequence of expressions that ended somewhere around a specific, cold kind of anger. $37, he said. Yes. Did you sign something in Duskwater? There was a form, she said. I signed it. I didn't. I wasn't thinking about the terms. I was thinking about the travel money and the 3 weeks. Let me see the form. I don't have it. He set the letter down. He wrote this himself, he said, or had someone write it. There's no official program. He invented it. Whatever you signed in Duskwater, it was his document with his terms. Doesn't matter if the document exists, Elena said. If he takes it to whoever passes for law in this territory, they'll side with him. He knows people. I'm nobody. You're not nobody, Gideon said, with a sharp edge that surprised her. She looked at him. His jaw was tight. I have $12, she said, because if they were having the real conversation, they should have it all the way. That's what I have. I've been here 2 months without wages because we didn't discuss. You should have wages, he said, in the flat tone of a man arriving at an obvious thing too late. That's a different conversation, she said. The point is I can't pay him $37. Gideon picked up the letter again, read it again, set it down again. She could see him running through options, the methodical, practical problem-solving of a man who has handled difficult situations by working the angles until something gave way. I can pay it, he said. No, she said immediately. Elena, no, she said again. If you pay it, it's an admission that he had a valid claim, and it hands him exactly what he wants, which is leverage. He'll use it again. Then we call his bluff, Gideon said. She looked at him. He doesn't want money, Gideon said. He never wanted money. He wants one of two things. Either you're gone or you're legally his success story. Married, settled, community stamp of approval. He tapped the letter. This is a push. He's trying to force a direction. Into getting married, she said. Or leaving, he said. The words sat between them. Elena looked at the letter. She thought about $37 and $12, and the photographs in her bag, and her brother's handwriting, and the gray mare Judith, who had apparently forgiven her for the grain store incident because she no longer showed active contempt, and the barn cat with the torn ear who slept near the kitchen door on cold mornings. She thought about the feeling she'd had standing next to Gideon in the yard with the 3 men on horses, the unexpected solidity of it, the way standing beside someone who wasn't going anywhere changed the entire weight of a situation. She thought about the fact that she hadn't had that feeling in so long she'd stopped knowing she missed it. I'm not leaving, she said. Gideon looked at her. I'm not leaving, she said again, more clearly, because it needed to be clear. Not because of Pruitt, and not because of $37, and not because the town has decided what my story is. She looked at him directly. But I need you to understand, if I stay, it's because I'm choosing to. Not because I'm being pushed into it, and not because I don't have the money to go. I need that to be... She stopped, searching for the word. Clean, Gideon said. Yes, she said. Clean. He held her gaze for a long moment, and something in his expression did the thing she'd stopped expecting and started hoping for. It opened, slightly. Not dramatically. Just enough to see that there was something behind the careful stillness he carried like a coat. Then we deal with Pruitt, he said. Together. Together, she said. Outside, the sky finally made its decision. The first snow of the season came down quiet and steady, covering the yard in white, and the whole world went clean and new and brutally cold. And inside the kitchen, they stood across the table from each other with a document between them that was meant to break something and had instead arrived at exactly the wrong moment for Harlan Pruitt's purposes. Because what he'd pushed had not broken. It had pressed 2 people closer together, and the ground between them was harder than he'd calculated. The snow stayed for a week. It came down for 2 days straight and then stopped. And the world outside the ranch was white and still and brutally cold, and the work of the property contracted to its essential core, keeping the cattle fed and the water from freezing and the barn warm enough to matter. Elena learned things about winter ranching that no one could tell you in advance, things you had to learn from the doing, how ice formed on the water troughs overnight and had to be broken by hand each morning, how the cattle bunched against the north fence when the wind came hard and needed to be moved before they hurt each other, how the cold had a way of making every task take twice as long and the daylight ran out before you were finished. She worked. She worked without being asked and without cataloging what she did, and the days shaped themselves around the work the way days do when the work is real and necessary and leaves no room for things that aren't. It was during this week that she and Gideon had the first real fight. It came out of nothing, the way the significant ones usually do. Not from the big things, which both of them were apparently capable of navigating with some grace, but from a small thing that had accumulated weight without either of them noticing. It was about the horses. She had made a decision about the rotation of the two mares in the south pasture, a practical decision based on her reading of how the grass was holding up under the snow, and she'd acted on it without consulting Gideon because in her mind it was an obvious call, and she was tired, and the cold made everything feel more urgent. Gideon found out when he went to check the south pasture, and the mares weren't there. He came back in with the particular stillness of a man who is not going to say the first thing that comes to mind, which Elena had learned to read well enough to know it was not the same as a man who is fine. "You moved the mares," he said. "The south grass was getting thin under the snow load. I moved them to the east section. The east section has the gap in the fence at the corner post." She stopped. "What gap?" "The corner post I've been meaning to reset for 2 weeks." His voice was level. They could push through it. Elena felt the specific cold feeling of a mistake that hasn't finished arriving yet. "I didn't know about the post." "I know you didn't," he said. "That's the point. I was trying to help. You didn't ask me," he said, and there it was, the actual thing, stripped of the fence post and the mares and the practicality. "You made a decision about my property without asking me." "I've been making decisions about this property for 2 months," she said, and she heard the sharpness in her own voice and didn't soften it. The hinges, the latches, the pantry door, the calf, the grain store. "You've never had a problem with any of it." "Those were things inside the house. The horses are different?" "Yes," he said. "Different." She looked at him. "Why?" He opened his mouth and then closed it, and she could see him working through something that was more complicated than the horses or the fence post, something that had been sitting underneath the practical surface of their arrangement and had just pushed up through it. "Because this is still my ranch," he said. "I know that sounds... It sounds like you're drawing a line," she said. "I'm not drawing a line." "Then what are you doing?" He rubbed the back of his neck, which was a thing she'd learned he did when he was frustrated with his own inability to say something right. "I'm saying there are things I need to know about," he said. "On my own property, that's all." "And if I'd asked you, you'd have said no?" "No, I'd have told you about the post." "Then the problem isn't that I moved them, it's that I didn't come to you first." "Yes," he said. Elena stood with that for a moment. She thought about the reflex that had made her act without asking. The long practiced self-sufficiency of a woman who had learned that waiting for permission was another way of waiting to be told no, that it was always safer to act and deal with the consequence than to ask and hand someone the ability to stop her before she started. "The mares are probably fine," she said. "The snow is packed hard at the base of the east fence. They won't push through until it thaws." "Probably," he said, "but I'll check." "I'll come with you." They went out together into the white cold, and the mares were where she'd put them, and the fence post was where Gideon had said it was, and the mares had not pushed through it because she was right about the packed snow. They stood in the east pasture in the sharp silence of a winter afternoon and looked at the horses, and the horses looked back with the mild indifference of creatures who were warm enough and had eaten recently and found the human drama around them largely irrelevant. "I should have asked," Elena said. "I should have told you about the post," Gideon said. "We're both right," she said. "That's usually how it goes," he said. It wasn't an apology from either of them, exactly, but it was something more useful than an apology. It was the acknowledgement of two people who were genuinely trying to figure out how to occupy the same space without absorbing each other, and who had hit a real edge and were standing on it together looking at what it was made of. They walked back to the barn in the cold, and he reset the corner post that afternoon, and she helped hold it while he packed the ground around it. And by supper they were back to the kitchen quiet that had become their normal, a little rougher at the edges than before, but no less solid underneath. She thought about that later, about the fact that they'd fought and the world hadn't ended, and neither of them had left. She'd spent enough years around people for whom any friction was either a catastrophe or an excuse that the alternative felt genuinely strange, almost uncomfortable in its ordinariness. She was still thinking about it when she wrote the letter to her brother the following morning. She'd started it 3 times since reading his and thrown each attempt away. The first had been too careful, every sentence managed within an inch of its life. The second had swung too far the other direction and said things she meant, but wasn't sure she was ready to have received. The third she'd abandoned midway because she'd realized she was writing to a version of her brother from 3 years ago, and she didn't actually know who he was now, with 2 small children and the time that had passed between them. She wrote the fourth one short. She told him she was in Blackthorn Ridge and intended to stay for the foreseeable future. She told him the children sounded like trouble in the family tradition. She told him 60 miles wasn't an impossible distance, and she'd received his letter, and she was glad he'd sent it, which was the truest thing she could say without saying more than she was ready for. She sealed it before she could revise it again, and gave it to Pete to take to the post on his next trip to town. Gideon saw her give Pete the letter and said nothing, but at supper he poured her coffee without being asked, which was a thing he did when he was registering something without making it a production, and she accepted it the same way. The snow melted in the second week of December, which felt early but wasn't unusual for the territory, and the world went from white to brown and gray, and the work expanded back out to its full scope, and Pruitt's letter had been sitting in the kitchen drawer for 10 days. Gideon had drafted a response with the help of a man in town named Alderton, who was not quite a lawyer but knew enough law to be more useful than nothing. The response was measured and specific and made 3 arguments: that no official program existed in any territory record that could be verified, that the document Elena had signed in Duskwater had been obtained under conditions that misrepresented its terms, and that any attempt to enforce payment would result in a public accounting of the mayor's unauthorized use of town resources to facilitate a personal arrangement. It was, in Alderton's words, the kind of letter that made the recipient understand that the cost of pushing further exceeded the cost of stopping. Elena read the draft at the kitchen table and thought it was good and said so. Alderton wrote most of it, Gideon said. You told him what to say. I told him the facts. You knew which facts to tell him, she said. That's the same thing. He looked at her with the slightly off-balance expression she'd started to produce in him occasionally, the look of a man who is used to being right about things and is being surprised by the specific form that rightness takes. They sent the letter on a Tuesday. Pruitt's response came back in 4 days, which was fast enough to tell them he'd been anticipating it and had his own version ready. His response was shorter and considerably less specific, a retreat dressed up as a reconsideration, the language of a man who had decided the ground wasn't worth the fight but didn't want to say so plainly. He made no further mention of the $37. He wished them both well in vague, warm terms that contained about as much genuine warmth as a fence post. Elena read it twice and then looked at Gideon. Is it over? She said. The letter is over, he said. Pruitt's not over. He'll find a different angle eventually. But not right now. Not right now. She nodded. She felt the specific release of a thing that had been pressing on her for weeks finally lifting, not gone, but lightened, the way a door feels different once you know it's unlocked, even if you're not opening it yet. There's something else, Gideon said. She waited. He'd been standing at the window, and now he turned, and his expression had changed into something she recognized as the face he wore when he'd been thinking about something for a while and had decided to say it. There was a deliberateness to it, a choosing. I want you to stay, he said, properly. Not 3 weeks, and not because you don't have anywhere to go, and not because Pruitt's making it complicated to leave. He paused. Because you choose to. Elena looked at him. I know I'm not... He stopped. Tried again. I know this isn't an easy thing I'm offering. It's a hard place and a lot of work, and I'm not good at... He gestured at roughly the space between them, meaning everything that wasn't the ranch. At any of this. I know that. You're better at it than you think, she said, which was what he'd said to her about family weeks ago, and she watched him register that. I mean it formally, he said. I mean, I want to marry you. If that's something you... He stopped again, and there was something almost painful about watching him work through it, a man who had spent a decade being sufficient to himself trying to articulate that he wasn't anymore, and had made his peace with that. You're asking me, she said. Yes. Not because of Pruitt. Not because of Pruitt. Not because of what the town thinks. Elena, he said, with the flat, steady patience of a man who means what he says and would like that to be enough. I'm asking because I don't want to not ask. I've been thinking about it for a month, longer probably, if I'm honest, and He let out a breath. I'm trying to be honest. She stood and looked at him in the winter light coming through the kitchen window. This difficult, careful, quietly stubborn man who had walked past 8 women and stopped at the one who wasn't trying. And she thought about everything that had followed from that single, strange, inexplicable choice. The wagon ride and the first silence, and the mayor and Dorothea Crane and her brother's letter, and the snowstorm, and the corner post, and the fight, and the letter from Pruitt, and the way he poured her coffee. She thought about the fact that she hadn't planned an escape in 2 months. I need to tell you something first, she said. He waited. 3 years ago I was engaged, she said. The man was... It doesn't matter exactly what he was. It matters that I didn't see it clearly until it was almost too late. And when I left everything. The town, the people, all of it. Burned it down and ran. She kept her eyes on his. I'm not running from anything here. I want you to know that. I'm not staying because I have nowhere to go or because this is better than something else. I'm staying because this is... She stopped, then pushed through. Because you're honest with me. And I'm honest with you. And I didn't know how much I'd been missing that until I had it. Gideon held her gaze the whole time. That's what I needed to tell you, she said. Okay, he said. Okay, she said. He crossed the kitchen, not quickly, just steadily, the way he did everything, and took her hand in both of his, and his hands were calloused and cold from the morning work, and she felt the specific reality of them, the weight and the roughness, and she thought, this is what it actually feels like. Not the version from before, the performed version, but the actual thing. 2 people who've seen each other clearly and are still standing in the same room. Yes, she said, I'll marry you. Something shifted in his face. Not a dramatic shift, just the very quiet release of a man who has been holding something tightly for a long time and has finally allowed himself to set it down. Okay, he said again, softer. You're going to have to work on saying things other than okay, she said. Probably, he said. She laughed, and he almost smiled. The closest to a full smile she'd seen from him, which wasn't that close by most standards, but was enormous by his. And she thought that this was the thing. This was exactly the thing. This crooked, ordinary moment in a cold kitchen on a hard ranch in the middle of the frontier, and she would take it over anything polished. They told Pete first, because Pete found out by accident that same afternoon when he came in for an additional rope and walked into the kitchen at a moment that required no explanation. His face went through approximately 7 expressions in 4 seconds and landed on a grin so broad it looked like it might cause structural damage. I knew it, he said. Get the rope and go, Gideon said. I knew it from the first week. Pete got the rope and went, and they heard him say something to Cass in the yard outside that involved a sound of triumph, and Elena stood at the kitchen table and felt something she hadn't felt in years, something embarrassingly simple, happiness. The ordinary domestic kind, which is the hardest kind to come by and the easiest to underestimate until you've spent long enough without it. The talk of the wedding reached town within a week, because Pete told the blacksmith's apprentice, and the blacksmith's apprentice told everyone else, and the reaction was complicated. Some people were genuinely glad. There were people in Blackthorn Ridge who had watched Gideon Vale run that ranch alone for a decade with a kind of resigned concern, the way communities watch their most capable members slowly calcify in isolation, and the news that he had chosen someone and intended to marry her produced a real and uncomplicated relief in those people. Others were not glad, and their not gladness took the specific form of increased urgency, as if the formalization of the situation made their objections more pressing rather than less. Dorothea Crane was reported to have said that the whole business was rushed and irregular. The families of 2 of the other selection women apparently felt that a proper marriage announcement only underlined how publicly their daughters had been passed over. Pruitt said nothing publicly, which was the most concerning response of all. Elena heard all of this through Pete and through Gideon and through the particular texture of the town when she went in for supplies. The way conversations shifted when she entered a store. The way some people greeted her with a warmth that was pointed and deliberate, making a small declaration with their friendliness, while others found reasons to be busy with other things. She filed all of it away without letting it change her weight in the room. She had made her decision. The town could arrange itself around that fact however it needed to. What she had not anticipated was the visit from Margaret Hollis. Margaret was 61, a widow who had been in Blackthorn Ridge since before Gideon was born. who had known his parents, who ran the town's small lending library out of the front room of her house with a calm authority that had somehow escaped all of Pruitt's political gravity. She arrived at the ranch on a Thursday morning unannounced and knocked on the door, and when Elena answered, she looked her over with the frank, unhurried assessment of a woman who has been reading people for 6 decades and does not see the point in pretending she isn't. "I'm Margaret Hollis," she said. "I knew Gideon's mother." "Come in," Elena said. Margaret came in and sat at the kitchen table without being directed to it, and accepted coffee without waiting to be asked, and Elena sat across from her and waited. "I'm not here to tell you what people are saying," Margaret said. "You already know what people are saying." "I do," Elena said. "I'm here because someone should tell you that Gideon Vale has been the loneliest man in this territory for 10 years, and he spent all of that time being too proud and too self-sufficient to let anyone close enough to notice." She held her coffee cup in both hands. "His mother was my friend. She worried about him before she died, about what he'd become if he was left too long alone." Elena said nothing. She listened. "I watched you from a distance these past 2 months," Margaret said. "The way you walk around this property, the way he is now compared to how he was." She paused. "He's not fixed. You understand that. He's still difficult, and he'll be difficult for years. He doesn't know how to ask for things, and he carries his losses like they're structural, and he'll drive you half mad with his silences." "I know," Elena said. "Do you?" Margaret looked at her directly. "Because a lot of women think they know and they find out differently after." "I know," Elena said again, steadier. "I'm not easy either. I run from things. I've run from things my whole life. I'm still working out whether I've actually stopped or whether I've just gotten tired." She held the older woman's gaze. "But I'm not running from him." Margaret studied her for a long moment. "Good," she said, finally. She finished her coffee. She set the cup down. She stood and put her coat back on with the brisk efficiency of a woman with other things to do. "The wedding," she said at the door. "Don't do it in Pruitt's courthouse. Do it outside." She gave Elena a look that was the closest she'd come to warmth. His mother would have said the same. She left. Elena stood in the kitchen doorway and watched the old woman's wagon make its way back down the road toward town, and thought about everything she'd said, and about Gideon's mother worrying about her son across the years, and about the particular way real things got carried forward by the people who noticed them. She thought, outside. She went to find Gideon to tell him. Gideon's response to outside was a single nod, which Elena had learned to read as the equivalent of a lengthy speech of agreement from anyone else. The wedding was set for the 3rd Saturday of December, which gave them 2 weeks and which Elena privately thought was exactly enough time, long enough to arrange what needed arranging, short enough that neither of them would have the opportunity to overthink themselves into complications. She'd seen what happened when people had too long to prepare for something that was essentially simple. They filled the time with doubt. Margaret Hollis, having delivered her verdict and apparently decided this was now partially her project, arrived at the ranch 2 days later with a woman named Ruth, who altered clothing and a practical list of things that needed to happen before the date. Elena received this with a mix of gratitude and the particular claustrophobia of someone who has managed her own affairs for years and is not entirely sure how to accept help without feeling like she's surrendering something. "You don't have to do all this," Elena said, while Ruth measured her shoulders with a cloth tape and Margaret examined the front room with an evaluating eye. "I know I don't," Margaret said. "I'm doing it because I want to. Accept it without making it difficult." Elena accepted it without making it difficult mostly. Ruth let out the seams of a dark green wool dress that had been Elena's since before everything fell apart. She'd carried it across the territory in the bottom of her bag, never finding an occasion right enough for it, and now she handed it over and watched Ruth's capable hands work on it, and thought about the last time she'd had reason to wear something like this, and decided not to spend long in that memory. The harder conversation was with Gideon. It came 4 days before the wedding, in the barn during the evening feeding, which had become one of their reliable times for talking. The rhythmic work of it created the right conditions, something to do with your hands while you said difficult things. Elena had been carrying something since Margaret's visit. Not about the wedding. She was clear on the wedding. It was something older and more personal that she'd been turning over in the back of her mind since she'd written to her brother, since she'd sat on the barn floor with the gray cat on a cold evening and felt the particular weight of the things she'd been hauling around the territory without unpacking. She fed the first two horses before she said it. I need to tell you about what happened, she said, before I came here. The whole of it. Gideon was measuring feed on the other side of the barn. He didn't stop working, which she appreciated. You don't have to, he said. I know, she said. I want to. So she told him. She told him about the town in the east where she'd grown up, and the man, his name was Douglas Farrell, and she said it out loud for the first time in 3 years, because names had power mainly when you refused to say them, and the way it had started sensibly enough and gone wrong so gradually that she hadn't seen the full shape of it until she was deep inside it. She told him about the money she'd had, left to her by her father, and how Douglas had moved it around until moving it back became complicated, and about the specific loneliness of being in a situation where the person causing the harm is also the person you've organized your whole life around, and leaving requires dismantling yourself before you can go anywhere. She told him she'd left with $40 and a bag and her mother's photographs and her green dress and nothing else, and that her brother had sided with Douglas in the immediate aftermath, not out of malice, she thought now, but out of the frontier instinct that said men's claims on property were more legible than women's claims on their own lives. And he'd been wrong, and he'd taken a while to know it, and by the time he knew it, she was already gone, and keeping gone had felt easier than the alternative. She told him all of it in the flat, factual voice she'd learned to use for the bad parts of her history. The voice that kept the feelings from flooding the words. And when she finished, she was still feeding horses, and Gideon was still measuring feed, and the barn was warm with animal warmth and the smell of hay. He was quiet for a moment. The $37, he said. She looked over at him. When Pruitt sent that letter, you said you had $12. His voice was careful. That was why you couldn't pay it. Yes. And you didn't want me to pay it because I've had someone manage my money for me, she said, and I know how that ends. He set down the feed measure. He turned and looked at her across the barn, and his expression was doing the thing she'd learned to recognize, working something through, fitting pieces into their right places. I'm not Douglas Farrell, he said. I know you're not. I'm saying it because I want it said, not because I think you don't know. He held her gaze. And the wages, the back wages, since October. I'll figure out what's fair, and I'll pay them. They're yours. I should have done it from the beginning. Elena looked at him for a long moment. There was something in his voice, not performance, not demonstration, just the plain, unglamorous intention of a man who understood what she'd told him and was responding to the actual thing rather than the surface of it. Okay, she said. Okay, he said. They finished the evening feeding and walked back to the house through the cold, and neither of them said anything more about Douglas Farrell that night, and Elena noticed that she felt lighter than she had before the conversation. Not healed of anything, not fixed, just lighter, the way you feel when you've been carrying something at an awkward angle for years and someone helps you adjust the weight. The morning of the wedding was gray and cold, and the ground was frozen hard, and someone had left a small bunch of dried winter grass tied with a piece of twine on the porch step, which Elena picked up and brought inside and put in a jar on the kitchen table, because whoever had left it, she suspected Pete, though he denied it thoroughly when asked, meant something by it, and she thought it should be inside where it was warm. People started arriving at mid-morning. This surprised Elena. She had expected the handful they'd invited, Margaret and Ruth and Alderton and the Hands, and instead found that word had traveled the way word traveled in frontier communities. And people came who hadn't been invited because they wanted to come. And people came who had been talking badly about her for 2 months because something in the situation had reached them in a way that Dorothea Crane's version hadn't. And people came who had known Gideon's parents and wanted to see the man who had been lonely for a decade finally not be. Not everyone came with pure motives. She understood that. Some came out of curiosity, some out of social obligation, some out of the complicated mixture of feelings that make people attend events they can later describe to people who weren't there. That was human, and she didn't begrudge it. She'd been one of those people at enough gatherings herself to know the texture. But some of them came because they meant it. And those people she could feel in the room the way you can feel the difference between weight and warmth, and she held on to that. Hobson came. She didn't expect that. He arrived alone, without the other 2 men, and he stood at the edge of the gathered group with his hat in his hands and the expression of a man who has done something he regrets, and is trying to find the form in which to say so. Elena saw him before Gideon did, and she went to him. "You came," she said. "My niece told me to," he said. "She heard about the wedding. She said—" He stopped, worked his jaw. "She said what you told me in the yard was right about Pruitt. She's been thinking about it." He turned his hat over in his hands. "She's not. She doesn't hold bad feelings about you personally. I want you to know that." "I don't hold them about her," Elena said. "She had nothing to do with any of it." Hobson nodded. He seemed to be trying to find something else to say, and not finding it, which Elena thought was probably enough. Not all amends came with speeches, and the ones that didn't were sometimes more honest. "There's cake," she said. "Pete made it. I'll warn you it's lopsided." Hobson almost smiled. "I'll get some." She left him to it and went to find Gideon. He was standing near the fence at the edge of the yard, slightly apart from the crowd, wearing his good coat and the expression of a man who is in the middle of a large social event and is tolerating it with discipline. She came up beside him, and he looked at her, really looked at her, in the full green wool dress with her hair actually staying where she'd put it for once, and something moved in his face that he didn't try to manage. "You look—" he started. "Don't say fine," she said. "I wasn't going to say fine," he said, and he sounded faintly offended, which she thought was a good sign. "What were you going to say?" He looked at her for a moment. "Like you belong here," he said. "That's what I was going to say." She held that for a moment. It was not a conventional thing to say to a woman on her wedding day. It was also, she thought, exactly the right thing. More right than beautiful, more right than anything that referred to surfaces. Like you belong here. After 34 years of moving, of not belonging, of treating belonging like a luxury she couldn't afford, it was the one thing she needed to hear said plainly. "I do," she said. The ceremony was short, which they'd both wanted. Alderton had some authority to perform it. Exactly what kind of authority was left deliberately unclear, but no one in Blackthorn Ridge was inclined to challenge it, including Pruitt, who had not come, and whose absence was noted without being mourned. They stood in the yard under the gray December sky, with the frozen ground solid underfoot, and the crowd pressed close enough to generate some warmth, and Margaret Hollis standing to Elena's left, with an expression that contained something that might have been grief and something that might have been relief, which was not contradictory because the things she was thinking about were not contradictory. Gideon took Elena's hand and looked at her and said what he'd written himself, without help, which she knew and which she thought was the bravest thing she'd seen him do. "I'm not good at this. I want to be better at it. I'll spend the rest of my life trying." It was 11 words of actual content, and it was everything. Elena said what she'd written herself, which was also short because she did not trust herself with long. "I stopped running. I'm here. That's what I have." Alderton said the legal part, and some people cried, and Pete definitely cried, though he claimed afterward to have had something in his eye, and the ceremony ended and the day went on, and that was that. The cake was lopsided. Dorothea Crane arrived late. She came after the ceremony, which Elena thought was deliberate, a way of attending without fully attending, maintaining her position while not missing it entirely. She stood near the edge of the gathering with Clara Whitfield and ate cake and watched with an expression that had some of its old sharpness in it, but also something else, something reluctant and unresolved. The expression of a woman who has held a firm opinion for a long time and is meeting evidence that doesn't quite fit it. Elena caught her eye once. Neither of them smiled, but Dorothea held her gaze for a moment without looking away first, which Elena thought was the closest they were going to get to a truce, and she was fine with that. Margaret found her late in the afternoon, when the crowd had mostly thinned and the cold had reached the point where only the most committed guests were still standing in the yard. She looked at Elena with those sharp, experienced eyes and said, "Well?" "Well," Elena said. "His mother would have been glad," Margaret said, which was not a small thing for her to say, and Elena understood that. "I'll try to deserve that," she said. Margaret patted her arm, which was the most physical warmth she'd expressed all day, and went to get her coat. The years after were not easy years. That needs saying plainly, because the frontier was not a place that rewarded sentiment with smooth passage, and the story of Gideon and Elena Vale after that December wedding was not a story of troubles resolved, but of troubles shared, which is a different and better thing. The first year brought a drought that lasted from May through September and cost them a third of the herd. They sat across from each other at the kitchen table and looked at the numbers and did not pretend the numbers were better than they were, and they made decisions together. Which cattle to sell, which to hold, which sections of land to let go fallow, where to cut and where to hold. Elena understood ranch finances in a way that surprised Gideon until he remembered that she'd managed money under pressure before, and the bad version of that had taught her the good version in the way that surviving things often does. They disagreed about the south pasture all through the drought. Gideon wanted to sell the section to free up cash. Elena thought the section was their best long-term grazing land, and selling it under pressure was the kind of decision that looks right in the short term and costs you for a decade. They argued about it twice, seriously, and the second time it got loud enough that Pete found reasons to be in the barn. Elena held her position and Gideon held his, and eventually they stopped arguing and started problem solving, which led to a third option they hadn't considered, which was to lease the section rather than sell, which preserved the asset and generated income and was, in retrospect, obviously right. "You could have said lease from the beginning," Gideon said afterward. "I could have," she said, "but you wouldn't have heard it until you'd argued yourself out of selling." He considered this. "That's probably true," he said. "I know it's true," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "You're not going to stop being right about things, are you?" he said. It wasn't exactly a complaint. It wasn't exactly not a complaint. "Probably not," she said. Her brother came the following spring. He arrived in April with his wife Sarah and the two children, James, 5 and serious-faced, who had indeed inherited the family stubbornness and wore it plainly, and Clara, 3, who had her mother's hair and her father's laugh and an absolute fearlessness around the horses that made Elena's heart do something complicated and glad. They stayed for a week. It was not an easy week. There were years of silence between Elena and her brother that didn't dissolve just because they were in the same room, and there were conversations that got started and didn't finish, and silences that lasted longer than they should have, and one evening where they said things that needed saying, and another where they didn't say the things that also needed saying, because some things require more than one visit to build the structure for. But Clara sat on Elena's lap on the third evening and fell asleep there, and Elena sat very still so as not to wake her, and Gideon brought her a blanket without being asked, and her brother sat across the room and watched this and said nothing, and his face said what he didn't say, which was enough. They left on a Sunday, and Elena stood at the gate and watched them go and felt the full, complicated weight of family. Not the ideal version, not the one you'd design if you were starting from scratch, but the actual version, built from years of specific people making specific decisions and living with the specific consequences, and deciding anyway to keep knowing each other across the distance of those decisions. She thought, "I can do this, not perfectly, but I can do this." She turned back to the ranch and went in for supper. Pruitt lasted another 3 years as mayor. He continued to be Pruitt, which meant he continued to find angles and run calculations and occasionally make things difficult, but the particular leverage he'd tried to use on Elena never materialized into anything real, and after a while he seemed to accept that the situation had calcified in a way he couldn't alter and redirected his energy toward other targets. He and Gideon maintained a professional relationship of mutual wariness that never became friendship and never became open war, which was the best available outcome, and they both knew it. The county incorporation happened eventually, as Pruitt had predicted, and when it did, Gideon's influence in the process was significant in ways that Pruitt had always understood it would be. And the irony was not lost on anyone that the arrangement Pruitt had engineered to bring Gideon into the fold had instead produced a version of Gideon who was considerably harder to manage than the isolated, solitary version would have been. Elena, who understood politics the way she understood finances, from the experience of having been on the wrong side of them, helped Gideon navigate the county process with a precision that surprised him the first time and stopped surprising him after that. "You know how this works," he said, after one particularly knotted meeting with the county commissioner's representative. "I've met men like that before," she said. "Different coat, same calculation." He looked at her. "Where did you learn?" "Experience," she said. "Mostly bad experience, which is the fastest kind." He thought about that. "I should have you in every meeting." "Yes," she said. "You should." He started bringing her to meetings. Margaret Hollis died in the third year, in the spring, peacefully enough by frontier standards. She left her lending library to a younger woman in town with instructions that it not be moved, reduced, or made into anything more official than it already was. She left Elena a small package containing 3 books and a note that said, "For a woman who fixed things." The books were well worn and marked at certain pages, and Elena read every marked passage and understood that Margaret had read them in the same spirit. As a person looking for evidence that living through difficult things was possible and occasionally worthwhile, she kept the books on the shelf in the front room where anyone could read them. Pete eventually left. Not in a bad way, but in the way of young men who have learned what they needed to learn in one place and are ready to carry it somewhere else. He went east, toward the new settlements that were opening up as the territory developed, and he wrote occasional letters that were earnest and optimistic and occasionally sensible. And Elena wrote back, and Gideon dictated additions that Pete said he could always tell were Gideon's because they were shorter than everything else. The ranch grew, not explosively, not in the way of ambition for its own sake, but steadily, the way things grow when they're managed by people who understand what they have and are not trying to be something other than what they are. They added a section of land to the north when the neighboring property came available at a price that made sense. They built a second barn. They hired a woman named Dora to help with the house, not because Elena wanted to be relieved of housework exactly, but because the ranch had grown to the point where the ranch itself required her attention alongside Gideon's, and the distinction between house and ranch had blurred in a way that the old structures didn't account for. Dora was 26 and recently widowed and wary in the way people are when they've been through something hard, and Elena watched her and thought, "I know this." She gave her time and the particular combination of clear expectations and unstated respect that she'd found to be the only thing that actually worked with people who were rebuilding themselves. And after about 4 months, Dora stopped flinching at unexpected sounds and started making opinions known about how the kitchen was organized, which Elena took as a good sign. The townspeople sorted themselves out over time, the way townspeople do. The ones who'd been hostile softened or moved away or continued being hostile, but with less conviction, because the thing they'd been hostile about had proven itself real in the most ordinary way, by continuing to exist and be itself without requiring their approval. Elena became a known quantity in Blackthorn Ridge, which was the best available outcome in a frontier town. Not beloved, not hated, but known. Trusted with specific things. Understood to be a particular kind of person. She had the kind of reputation that meant people came to her when they had a problem that required someone who would say the true thing rather than the comfortable thing, and she found she didn't mind that. It was a use for the parts of herself that had been sharpened by years of necessary practicality. She wrote to her brother regularly. He wrote back. The visits happened once a year, sometimes twice, and the years slowly built the thing that one visit couldn't. Familiarity, the mundane accumulating kind, the kind that means you know someone's children's habits and their preferences for mourning and the particular shape of their silences. James grew into a serious, careful boy who reminded Elena of Gideon in ways she found both funny and moving. Clara remained fearless and opinionated, and the horses tolerated her completely, possibly because she hadn't learned yet to be appropriately cautious around them. Elena kept the photographs on the shelf in her room, not buried in a bag, but on the shelf, visible. Her mother's face had stopped ambushing her and started just being there, the way people are when you've made a decision to let them take up space in the present rather than the past. Some evenings she and Gideon sat on the porch after the day's work was done, in the cold or the warmth depending on the season, and didn't say much because they had reached the particular stage of marriage where silence between two people is a form of language rather than an absence of one. The frontier stretched away from them in every direction, enormous and indifferent and brutal in the way it had always been, and neither of them felt small inside of it the way they once had. He was not easy to live with, even then. He was still difficult with his silences and slow to ask for things, and occasionally convinced he was right about something longer than the evidence warranted, and she was still prone to acting before consulting and carrying problems alone past the point of usefulness, and occasionally managing her emotions in ways that looked like strength from the outside and were actually old habits in good coats. They knew these things about each other. They named them sometimes, carefully, when naming them was useful, and left them unnamed when naming them would only be performing insight without doing anything with it. One evening, 3 years in, they were sitting on the porch in the late summer dark, and Gideon said, without preamble, in the way he had of beginning conversations in the middle, "You remember the wagon, first day." "Which part?" she said. "You said you weren't planning to stay." "I remember," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I knew you'd stay," he said. "I didn't know when or why, but I knew." She looked at him. "How?" He thought about it. "You fixed the hinge," he said. "First week. You didn't have to. You didn't ask. You just—" He made a gesture that meant you did the thing. You don't do that in a place you're leaving. Elena sat with that for a while. The night was warm and the ranch was quiet around them, and somewhere out in the dark the cattle moved with their low, indifferent sounds, and the stars were out in the particular abundance they achieved on clear summer nights on the open frontier, thick and indifferent, and very far away. "I didn't know I was staying," she said, "when I fixed the hinge." "I know," he said, "but your hands did." She looked at her hands for a moment, the calloused, capable hands of a woman who had spent years fixing things and had finally, without planning to, fixed her way into somewhere she wanted to be. "You're occasionally right about things," she said. "Occasionally," he agreed, and the thing that moved across his face was a full smile, finally, unambiguous, rare enough that she still noticed it, still felt it land. Years later, travelers crossing Blackthorn Ridge heard the story. They heard different versions depending on who was telling it. Pete's version was dramatic and detailed, and improved with each telling. Margaret Hollis's version, which circulated after her death through the books she'd left and the people she'd known, was briefer and more honest. Hobson's niece, who eventually married a man in a town 50 miles south and lived a full and largely happy life, told her own version to her children, and her version was the one that understood the story correctly, that it was not a story about being chosen, but about two people who were honest enough with each other to build something from that honesty. The most honest version was the simplest one. A woman arrived in a town not planning to stay. A man who had stopped expecting anything particular looked at her and saw the only real thing in the room. Neither of them knew what they were doing. Both of them did it anyway. The frontier was brutal and indifferent and did not care about their story, and they were two imperfect people who fought occasionally and were wrong regularly and carried their losses around like furniture they hadn't figured out where to put. But they were honest with each other, and they did not run. And in a world where most things were temporary and most trust was conditional and most people were performing something, that turned out to be enough. More than enough. The kind of enough that built a life and held it together through drought and winter and the long, ordinary middle of years, and didn't need the world's approval to know what it was. Elena Vale stood on the porch of the ranch she had fixed and built and argued over and made her own, and she watched the prairie in the evening light, and she felt not happy in the easy, uncomplicated sense, but something steadier and more honest than happiness. She felt like herself, the full version, the one she'd been too tired and too frightened to inhabit for most of her adult life. She felt like someone who had stopped running long enough to find out where she was. And where she was, it turned out, was exactly enough.
Last night, y'all, my PC, my main PC, not this one. So my hello Keisha, what's with the list? Can I add to? Yes, you can. Let me get you Quest Help going for you. So Quest Help will give you ideas on how to add to the quest log. You can type out exclamation quest and then whatever you wanted to do after that. You can add multiple quests, tasks by putting a comma in between each task. A favorite person who I asked that question said, you have to have the bottom half goat or else you get this all the time. Then they played the ghost. Oh my God. That's crazy. Wow. Yeah. Yeah, I did a research in Discord. The app wouldn't share would work. After that, voice mod is an F. No. Yeah, y'all. So my computer, my main PC, y'all, it will not turn back on. And I think it's probably a power supply issue. Because I have a dedicated UPC. So I'm pretty sure it was not UPC related. And but I have an older machine, so worst case, I'm going to either swap out the power supply, see if that works, or I'm just going to use my really old machine to as my gaming PC. It's not that, it's like it's old by like current standards. I mean, it's a 1070, but that graphics card still works just fine for Final Fantasy 14 and Fortnite. So I think I'd still be fine to use it. I just have to like, yeah, I think we'll still be fine if we use that setup. But nonetheless, it's kind of a pain that I have to now troubleshoot the 3070 PC. So, I mean 3080 PC. I don't think my 3080 can be used for the motherboard that's in the older machine, but I'm going to check that out. I'm going to check to see if it is possible.